Welcome to Neighborhood Snapshot and LATV. My name is Bob Sardelli. I am a member of the Leominster Historical Commission. Today we welcome Mr. Win Mayo, who will be the focus of our interview, and his friend and colleague, Mr. Tom Bagley. I think you, the LATV audience, viewing audience, will enjoy the recollections of Leominster that these two fine gentlemen, lifelong residents of Leominster, prominent, well-respected businessmen, that these gentlemen will share with you today, with you and me today. You may recognize Tom Bagley from a previous interview with two other fine gentlemen when we did a program on downtown Leominster. We had two fine gentlemen, Mr. Joseph Goodhue and Mr. Bill Allen. So Tom was here previously. So welcome, Win, and welcome, Tom. I want to begin this interview, and we're going to jump during the interview. It's going to be a conversation, and Tom is here to help me jog Win's excellent memory of his growing up in Leominster. And we're going to focus on Win. And I want to begin by reading something from a booklet that's available to residents of Leominster and other people, a walking tour, free of charge, a walking tour of the Monument Square Historic District. And in this booklet, there are buildings and sites which are on the National Register of Historic Places. And I want to read a little paragraph about the Mayo building, which, if you know downtown Leominster and you know where Grant's used to be and where Allen's is and the Richardson block, well, there's the Mayo, Nickerson block, the Mayo building. It's at 38 Main Street. It's a two-story commercial building designed by architect Frank P. Lent. It was erected in 1909 by Hamilton Mayo. And Hamilton Mayo was your? Grandfather. Mm-hmm. Hamilton Mayo came to Leominster as a young lawyer in 1875. In 1883, he was appointed trial judge. He became president of the Leominster National Bank and a trustee of the Leominster Savings Bank. In municipal affairs, he served as Leominster's town auditor, member of the water board, chairman of the school board, library trustee, which you, Win, and Tom also served for years. And after incorporation as a city in 1915, that's when Leominster was incorporated as a city, Hamilton Mayo served as president of the city council. In 1904 and 1905, he represented the community of Leominster in the State House of Representatives. And when you had said, when we talked in the before a little bit about some of the things we would cover, your family goes back to the Indians. So tell us about that, please.
Well, actually, my great-great-great-grandmother on my father's side was a Wilder, and the Wilder family built one of the first houses in Leominster, came over as part of the Lancaster Grant or the Leominster Grant. When they bought that land from the Indians, they had had one previously, and this is the second grant, but what they did is the families would then turn over the land they had purchased over here in the grant to the next generation, and everybody'd come over and they'd build a house and so forth. Now, the first house in Leominster was built right off of Pleasant Street, right up a couple of miles, and this house where my family is, where my ancestors came from, was built just very, very near that house.
And that house
is still
there.
Yeah.
And if people in the audience know where the number 6 schoolhouse is on Pleasant Street, it's a white house
down.
The next house down.
Yeah.
Well, there's actually a new house that's been built to it, but then
yes, there is. There has been now.
It's a white house next to it with beautiful porch. It's got
those porches were added quite a long later.
And then you mentioned the very first home site in Leominster was the Gershom Houghton House, which is on Hill Street, and there's a marker there.
Right.
And there's also the well cap It's still there. The stone is still there, set up against the monument, put up by the Leominster Historical Society many years ago. But where did you grow up in Leominster?
Well, actually, I was born in the old Leominster Hospital, which not many people would remember, which was on Blossom Street.
Blossom Street. Was it like a?
It's still there. The building is still there. It's a large. It's about the second or third house up on Blossom Street as you go up from West Street. It's now a multi-family dwelling, but that was the hospital.
Was that built as a hospital? Or was it built a family dwelling that was taken over?
I'm not sure, but I have a suspicion it was developed. It was, I mean, it sort of grew like Topsy. I mean, when they had more need for it.
Hospital.
But it was definitely the hospital when I was born.
Leominster Hospital.
Yeah.
And what year was that?
I was born in 1917.
1917. So you are, as of now, how old?
91.
91 years old, and a young 91, and,
of course.
and sharp, and a great memory.
But actually, the hospital, I don't ever remember being in that hospital, of course, but I do remember being at a very early age in what would have been the original of the new Leominster Hospital. I remember going to have my tonsils out in that and show you the differences in administration levels. Shanna McFadden, who was the administrator of the hospital at that time, was also the anesthetist in the office and gave me the ether for my tonsils. So I remember that.
We would call that today multitasking. I just coincidentally, I remember when I was a kid, it was during the polio scare, and I didn't have polio, but there was a scare, and I had to have my spine tapped. And at that original building, not the one on Blossom Street, but the brick building, which we knew was the Leominster Hospital. That's where I was up, I think, on the top floor, the children's section. So, so your family homestead was on Orchard Street?
Yeah, we lived in a two-family dwelling on Orchard Street, just near the intersection with Merriam Avenue, and my whole childhood was sort of centered on that area, which involved going to Field Primary School, and my grandmother lived on Grove Avenue, and all my friends lived right in that immediate area.
So
we didn't go very far, actually.
So the other interviewees that I've had for various sections of Leominster, that was so typical. In those days, you pretty much stayed within your own territory, your own neighborhood. There was no need really to go elsewhere, and oftentimes if you wanted to go elsewhere around town, you had to go walk.
That's right. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Rockwell's Pond was a very big part of that whole time, because at a very early age, my father taught me to skate back in the days where you'd go down and put the skates on and turn the skates up with a key and put the straps on your shoes. And so that was part of our environment. Eventually, when I got a little older, but not too old, we extended our time, because I remember we used to hike a lot up to Mount Manustoc and go up to the old quarry and spend time in the quarry too. So.
That was children in those days. Things were not so organized, highly organized. It was informal. You had great times. You had a lot of fun, but you did your own.
Well,
things.
Actually, as I got older, all the way up into high school, a great deal of my social life was centered on the Unitarian Church.
The First Church.
The Boy Scout troop was there, and the Young People's Association and everything else, and a very, very active program for young people. So.
And Troop 1 is the oldest troop.
One of the oldest. I think one of the oldest in the country.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned Field Primary School. Now, is that the present Leominster
That's the present Historical Society. What they had at that point, they had a first grade on one. They had 4 rooms of first grade and second grade on the first floor, and the third in one, and then the 4th grade teacher also taught the 5th grade in the same room, and I went to the 4th and 5th grade there. Now, at that point, everyone after the 5th grade in those days, just prior to that, went next door to the Field Grammar School, which they came from everywhere, which was a big wooden, really old building. It's the remains of the pictures you'll see in the Historical Society, the old Field High School. And eventually, when the new high school was built, this became the grammar school. And we went there. We would have gone there to the, I would have gone there to the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, then 4 years of high school. But I had to go to George Street for the 6th grade because the new junior high was under construction. And I was in the first class that went all the way through that, the junior high.
Gallagher.
And Gallagher
it was eventually named Gallagher.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned the Field High School and the Field Grammar School. Were they the same building? Or
no, the Field. Yeah, they were. The Field. I wasn't aware of that, but the pictures in the Leominster Historical show the Field High School, and then I was talking about my grandmother being in the first class to graduate from that, and then later on, I never knew it as a high school. I always knew it as the grammar school, to which I would normally have gone, but didn't go because it was torn down and the building built.
We have a picture of the Field High School, and interestingly, that was the old high school from which your grandmother
she was in the first class to graduate from that class.
She was in the first graduating class, and we have a picture of her and her classmates. Very small class, and all girls.
4 or 5 girls.
4 or 5 girls. But interestingly, I found out later on, Field High School, FHS, and then when Leominster High was built, which became on West Street, which is now sadly a rundown building, sadly beautiful building, but it's run down, and then it became the Carter Junior High, but FHS became LHS, because FHS is Fitchburg, FHS, so LHS. So there's Dave Chester, a friend of mine. I tried to trick him with that bit of trivia. I discovered that, and he knew that.
Well, most people really can't understand. Tom would know it. Particularly, that rivalry was a very, very tense rivalry, and of course, encouraged by the football team, but all the athletic teams. But the Leominster High School football game, right back as far as I can remember, and I can see pictures of generations before me, that high school rivalry set the tone between the two cities for years. And later on, when Tom and I and a lot of others were starting to try and combine some of these services, there was an awful lot of resistance both ways. People couldn't adjust.
It was a very strong rivalry, and two of the prominent people at LATV, Kyle Pomeranian and Jack Sully, made a well-known documentary of the rivalry.
Oh, about the rivalry.
Of the rivalry, documenting the history. And this is a comment on today's society too. It was a strong rivalry in those days and through the years, and there was sportsmanship and so on. Today, in 2008, with our society and our culture in the United States, sometimes these rivalries get out of hand. Like currently, you're reading in the news about the Red Sox and the Yankees. Some of the things that the fans get out of hand. So we hope that the rivalry between Leominster and Fitchburg, cooperation.
Well, it's gradually. I think it's wonderful right now. I mean,
yes.
It's so changed, but there's still, I know people that came from Fitchburg originally who find it uncomfortable to go to the Leominster Hospital.
Well, they have to get over that. They have to get over that aspect of it. You mentioned on Orchard Street. And you had said it looks pretty much about today it's, you know, residential in the houses, but in those days, what did it look like? Not too much different, but there were other differences.
Well, there's still, even when I was very young, there was still some of those houses have been there quite a long time, up and down Orchard Street, Washington Street, and all those streets. And there, a lot of them were being converted and modernized even at that point. But I think in terms, I mean, we did discuss at one point a little bit about the transportation systems, yes, or the delivery of services. And I distinctly remember, of course, we didn't have any electric refrigeration, we had ice, and remember the ice man coming with a horse and wagon and to deliver the ice. And even, I don't remember so much the groceries being delivered, but by horse and wagon, but I remember them coming in the wintertime when they could have a pung on, you know, a sleigh type thing that they would be delivering stuff with.
Now, what were the streets in those days? I remember you had said, how were the streets? Were they plowed?
Oh,
or?
Wonderful. No, I don't know. I never remember. I was never aware of the streets being plowed. I'm sure they were, but was very aware of the sidewalks. The cities have never had the sidewalks plowed since. They're never as good by tractor, in my opinion, as they used to be by horse. They were smooth. They did both sides of the street, but of course we had fewer streets to cover.
So this was a one-horse
wooden plow? A one-horse man would stand on a platform with a plow ahead of it, and the horse would wander through the snow and plow.
Plow the sidewalks. And I remember from a previous interview, some of the interviewees had said that it wasn't so important to get the streets plowed because most of the people walked to work.
Yeah.
And there weren't a lot of automobiles.
There weren't any. No,
in fact, didn't people even put their cars up in the wintertime on blocks? Or?
Not that I'm aware of. The only old-time story of the old cars I remember, and I can't imagine this, of my mother cranking a Ford with me on the one arm. I've heard that story a number of times in the family, but I never was able to quite imagine it.
Now what about, we have now automobiles all over the place, in fact, maybe too many automobiles. Other technological changes. How, when your family used to listen to the radio, can you tell us something about radio?
Well, I tell you that the first radio that I remember in the family came from my father when I was about 10, bought a place up on the New Hampshire coast at Rye Beach. And we used to go there for all summer, and the family used to come down, and my uncle, who was the dentist, Dr. Foss in Leominster, was very mechanical and technical, and he got right into radio at the beginning of it. And I remember him coming down to the beach one summer and bringing this radio that was powered by an automobile battery. That was the first time we heard radio. But then later on, as the radio was a very big part. We all knew all the programs, and it was a very big part of it.
The family would gather around and wait for programs to come on.
I remember I'd go to visit my grandmother, and we would have to hear Amos and Andy and all the rest of the things.
Jack Benny,
and
then the musical programs.
It was quite a big thing in our lives.
Yeah.
The same way you were talking about other technical developments that I hadn't remembered, but the movies were a very big thing in our life. I mean, I can hardly remember being young enough that I didn't go to the movies.
And how were they different? Were they
all silent?
Silent movies.
Silent movies.
Silent movies. Joe Goodhue had mentioned that too. Yeah, same era.
Particularly, the McAvoy family had they had a theater where it used to be the Plymouth Theater, which is a parking lot over here. They had the original theater was there. And then
the music hall? Was that called music hall? Yeah.
They were very they were very successful, and then they built the Rialto Theater, which is now the recreation center there,
right? And now
the Y building there.
The Y building, and it's a church.
And that was when that was built. That was
Palace.
A fantastic
Yes,
thing.
yeah, real
And
movie
this
Palace.
great big organ, and the organ was a very vital part of all of the movies because the accompaniment was played to match the music.
So,
But then they had a big fire and the music hall burned, and they built the Plymouth Theater. And I remember very distinctly going to hear the first sound movies in the Plymouth Theater.
Yeah. So we have a gentleman. We have a gentleman here, Tom, who has from the era of no radio to
No
radio.
radio.
Now we have satellites, and we have equipment on the moon and Mars,
And
we have
virtually no electric refrigeration.
no electric refrigeration. From silent movies to now we have DVDs.
Speaking of the Rialto Theater, it comes to mind that I can recall when I was a child, bingo games being sponsored by the St. Jean's,
Yeah.
and the Rialto was filled with people playing bingo. The City Hall Auditorium and the St. Jean's Hall, all three were connected by intercom.
Oh.
Playing
And
one.
that was a big thing to do on Friday evening.
But they
in
came by
Leominster.
buses
Yeah.
too to
Yeah.
play in the game. It was a
Yeah.
very big
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Now we've changed. People are now very often home and they're watching television.
Television.
Which I hope they're watching this program.
One thing you haven't discussed, Win, was the transportation. You know, the trolleys and Whalen
Oh.
Park, et cetera.
Well, of course, that was very important as far as getting anywhere. I never remember going to Whalen Park by car. We probably did, but I don't remember because most of the time we went by trolley. And I mentioned it several times. It was really wonderful in the summertime because they had the open trolleys, and you could get on the trolley from the side and get up into the seats, and it was all open. And the trip to Whalum was a very big thing. And the trolleys themselves, there was a trolley that ran up Merriam Avenue that I used frequently to go to Fitchburg. Even when I was up and starting in high school, I took saxophone lessons, and I used to take the trolley from down where we used to live near down near the Gallagher Junior High School, and I get on the trolley there and go to Fitchburg on the trolley. And then of course you had the same thing going to Whalum. I can't remember the one. I guess there must have been one that went up North Main Street up to Fitchburg that way, but I don't remember that one. So, but the trolley was a very vital part of the transportation system.
Interurban trolley. You could go. I read somewhere you could go if you exchanged. You could go all the way almost to New York, one town.
Well, they used to have there was a trolley that went to Worcester.
Worcester, yeah, and then from
and
there.
then my mother talks about going to Clinton to take music lessons on the trolley. So
now these trolleys weren't these were the electric. They had the
electric,
wire, and then they were replaced later on by the trackless and
they,
then the
they,
buses.
They cut down the routes. In other words, they didn't have the trackless trolley didn't run everywhere. Eventually,
Right.
It was mostly between Leominster and Fitchburg, and I think on the main road to Leominster and Fitchburg, maybe to Whalum, but I'm not sure.
And you had mentioned that Merriam Avenue used to stop. If you drive up Merriam Avenue today and you start going
It's
up the
my
hill.
recollection that the trolley used to run
All the
up
way
and
to-
whatever, and when you get to the top of Merriam Avenue, it goes down
Into
just
the
before you
flats.
start across the flats to Lindell Avenue. Merriam Avenue didn't extend up there until that was all later developed as a subdivision.
So the trolley went through there,
but the
road
trolley went
itself.
through there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other changes, for example, telephone. Did you have a telephone or?
Oh yeah, we had a telephone. I always remember my father had a telephone number at the Pyrotex leather of 1. I remember. and my grandfather's number was 4.
Wow.
Too. I remember that. And the telephone exchange used to be up in the second floor of the Richardson building.
and it would be the old movies. You'd see the ladies with the switchboard.
Yeah, that's where they had that. That's where they did
yeah,
all of the.
They'd press and connect.
Yeah.
Any other technological changes that you?
Well,
you know,
no, of course. I think, of course, the big changes in the automobile itself are enormous. I mean, we thought everything was great, and it's like when you're living with something, you don't really realize how much better it could be until you live a few years and see what's happened to the automobile.
That has certainly changed that.
But a great deal of use of the train was very, very. I mean, almost people went to Boston. They went on the train, and there was great train service. So.
Train service, and there were and flight was not almost. You saw you saw. Charles Lindbergh, you were aware of Charles Lindbergh?
Well, you know, you asked me one time about significant times. You know, we always remember things. Like I remember so distinctly exactly where I was when they stepped off that capsule onto the moon. And I remember just like the same way being over in the parking lot at Manusna Country Club when somebody came running out and said Lindbergh had flown
across
the
Atlantic. Wow, wow. So
it was that big a thing.
Yes. So you've lived through so many significant
quite a few.
events
so much in the way
history.
Of technological change.
Yeah. And
although my father was in the tank corps in World War I, so. And they had a big parade after that. I remember just vaguely, not too well.
And you had mentioned how important parades were
very
when you
big,
were growing up.
very big.
Events
Well, they were first of all, they were a celebration, and second, they were sort of community type things. Leominster has always, even today, and its increased population, has always sort of been like a small town anyway, I think.
Yes.
And the community was much, I think, probably closer together then because it was smaller. And the parades on the holidays, particularly Memorial Day, were a big thing. And all the Boy Scout troops all marched, and the Girl Scouts, and all the veterans. And of course, there were many more veterans from the earlier wars alive.
Yes.
And it was a big holiday time.
And you had mentioned that even the way the people marched in those days, they would march. Today, it's kind of just.
Well, in other words, even in the Boy Scout troops, we learned about marching and learned all the commands and knew what. That was the sort of thing that was part of the military part of it was much more of it. Of the Boy Scouts, I think, than it was. And when they marched, we marched. Today, they sort of walk along.
There was even, and you mentioned this, at Leominster High School, there was a cadet corps already.
Yeah, well, up until about 4 or 5 years before I got to high school, they had what would be called compulsory military training in the high school. They had these old Civil War uniforms they wore, and they had I think the weapons they used were still from the Civil War, but they had military drill, and it was very competitive, and they were a very big part of the Memorial Day parades. They were really, and then most of the town came out for the parades.
And there are pictures of the cadet corps, cadet corps behind the Carter High, old Leominster High, and on the field. And the Corps, and for some reason.
I knew people who were in the Corps, who were older than I and could talk about it in later years, and I never heard any resentment from the boys that had to take part in it.
No, it was just. I have, when we were talking about this earlier, you jogged my memory about learning the commands of left face, right. I don't know where I learned those. Maybe it was in Scouts, maybe it was in phys ed at elementary school, but I remember they taught us, the commands, basic.
Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, when I went into the Navy and went to officers training corps, we had to have military, and everybody had to start to learn military drill and things of that type. And my earlier experience right off, I got to be a commander because I knew yes, simply because I knew the commands.
You had the
and had a
training.
loud voice.
Yeah. I have to mention this, and I know that if I don't, Alice will be upset. Homemade ice cream, and apparently you still are very good at making homemade ice cream.
Well, I still make it, but some of my fondest memories involve going up to. In my lifetime, it seems strange to have realized it, but when I was a small child, my grandmother lived on Grove Avenue, and they had 2 cows. They had cows and chickens and horses and everything on Grove Avenue in Leominster. And they always used to make the homemade ice cream. I remember always it was a big thing like at Memorial Day, there'd be the parades and things, and then we'd all go up to my grandmother's for lunch on the holiday. And I remember the homemade ice cream was a very big thing.
So many of those things, how things have changed. People made things, they canned, they preserved things, grew much of their own food. Although you lived in an area where you had access to what was Brockelman's, or where was the grocery store?
Well, all those stores were there, Brockelman's and the A&P, and I remember vaguely, I think the A&P was here before, if I remember correctly, but because I vaguely remember the First National Store moving into Leominster. But then you had Woolworths and Newbury's, which were very big.
I remember those.
And then you had the ice cream shops downtown, and
Goodhue's restaurant.
Downtown was like a small downtown. You could go, in those days you walk downtown and you would, you'd always meet somebody, see someone you knew.
And downtown, once people got downtown, that was the place to be because there were no malls, no shopping centers. Downtown was the center of the community.
I can remember.
And it was so active and.
I can remember the old days in downtown Leominster when the stores used to close on Wednesday afternoon, Bob. In fact, I used to play golf on Wednesday, and it was traditional. The stores were closed Wednesday afternoons, but open Thursday evenings.
Yeah.
Thursday evening was payday in Leominster, Friday in Fitchburg, I think.
And then W.T. Grant came into town, and being a national chain, they never heard of closing on Wednesday afternoon, so they remained open, and so all the other stores fell into place.
And people would come downtown on Wednesday afternoon, and the business owners saw that, and that tradition went out. Yes.
And we used to be, when I had my old insurance agency, Thursday night used to be very, very busy in our office.
Yeah, that was the Leominster Thursday night was. That's
well,
correct.
to show you the small town sort of aspect, when I was married, my wife came from Yonkers, New York, and didn't know anyone essentially in Leominster. And then by the time that the war came along, and I left for the service, and I came back after the war, and
World War II,
and I had thought I might like to go somewhere else. I wasn't over happy with what I was doing, had been doing before the war. And I remember my wife said, I'll go any way you want to go if that's what you want. But she said, I really do like it in Leominster, and I like being able to walk down the main street and say good morning to the people. So it was still had that sort of a downtown atmosphere. It still has a little of it, but not quite as much.
Well, I have to say that we're very glad that you stayed.
Yeah. But you asked, Warren, but another building that had a lot of change was the Nickerson building, in which Allen's is.
Yeah.
That burned. I remember going, because I lived close to downtown, and going over there. It was in the winter because there was a lot of freezing of the hose and the water from the hoses. That practically gutted that building. I think it burned twice, if I remember. But That was a big fire.
Yeah.
What do you remember of the old factories and the manufacturing companies in Leominster in the old days? You know, the Doyle Works and Pyrotechs?
Well, of course, I remember this building. I mean, this building was a later addition that DuPont built. All the other old buildings were all built by the Doyle Works. Bernard Doyle, this was his place, and I'm sure we don't have to labor that. I'm sure a lot has been done with that historically, and I'm quite familiar with the old, because I watched the whole development of the plastics industry in Leominster, and we won't go into that. I know enough has been done about that.
Well, if there's anything...
But the downtown, I mean, I don't remember particularly a lot of the same businesses that were still around, like a big thing with the shirt companies, and they're gone. And then we had all of these plastic things that they started really, well, historically, of course, early 30s with Sam Foster importing that first machine here. And then, of course, you get up to where you got Foster Grant with 125 machines. And yet that was all, well, I remember going over to the Richardson Piano Company, and that was a big industry, and they tried to make radio cabinets and did all kinds of stuff, but eventually they didn't make it.
Now, where was the Richardson Piano?
The Richardson Piano Case is where Foster Grant took over.
Yeah.
They took over the Richardson Piano Case Company. The Wellington Piano Case Company, which is now that apartment building
Wellington,
there,
near Doyle Field.
that was vacant for many years. I remember my father was very active in trying to save it. They were going to tear it down, I think. And I remember they bought it, I think, for something like $36,000, the whole building, and that's when they attracted
Selig?
Mendel Selig from
Selig,
Gardner, and he came down and started.
Yeah.
So
I went to high school with a couple of the
one of the
Selig girls.
Seligs, yeah. But a lot of, so I've seen the change to the plastic business, but now that itself is not here to the extent that it was. But all of the plastics business and all of the, the supporting industries, the tool industries, and all the things that went, and then eventually the chemical formulating all of the products that were molded and so forth, all got here as Foster Grant did, and they all. But that's I don't remember. Of course, the paper mill was still going, but that's not going. I don't remember the old leather board, which people talk about, which was down where Whitney Field is, or somewhere on that thing. That was the Harrison family, and I really don't. I never ever remember seeing it even, but I've heard about it.
So many changes. Harking back to. You mentioned Whalum Park. Whalum Park is no longer there, and you remember when it was.
It was a very big thing,
big thing.
Well, I used to go there quite often. My grandmother ran the photographic studio at Whalum Park for many years, and I remember a lot of these things when you get to be my age become a question of how much do you really remember, or what do you remember from reading about it afterwards. But I quite remember going there after the big tornado. They had a bad tornado that virtually destroyed Whalum.
Now this isn't the night. This is
it's not the 38. Not the 38 40. This is way back.
This is prior to the 38 hurricane.
Yeah.
We had a huge hurricane, which we'll talk about.
No.
But this was a tornado at Whalum Park.
Oh, they had a bad tornado. Took down all the big pine. A lot of the big pine trees. I'm quite certain the roller coaster came down too. That was they took them a while to get that back.
To get back from that. Do you remember well, I know you do, the 38 hurricane?
Oh, very well. I mean.
What about before the 36 floods? I know there were terrible floods.
I don't remember in particular the floods. All I know is prior to the 38 hurricane, the reason it was so severe here in Leominster, but everywhere, was that it had rained steadily for about six days. And at that,
sort of like our weather recently.
and at that time, I remember I was working at the old Wilder Manufacturing over in Hamilton, on a street off of Hamilton Street. We had the day of the hurricane. I mean, we'd been having these so much rain that the Nashua flooded, and our building was quite low. It was on the river there, and that flooded all of the cellar of the factory because of the overflow of the river. And then that afternoon, I remember I went home in the late afternoon. It really hit here late afternoon and early evening. And going home, I was living with my family up on Pleasant Street at the time, and that night the roof flew off. In the morning it had flooded, and that night the roof flew off the factory. Wow. So it was that was a real devastating. It was really a shame to see what it did, like to Merriam Avenue, just topple those great big maple trees over.
Yeah.
It wasn't that it was because the ground was so moist.
Saturated. Yeah, that was 38 and devastating to the whole, region.
As a matter of fact, the day after, it was beautiful. I remember it was a wonderful day, and it was a great day for everybody to start to try and find their way where you could around town and repair what had been done at home.
Because there are photographs, well documented of the devastation, and
I hate to say it, but I enjoyed the storm. I mean, I like storms, and it was really an exciting storm.
Yeah, storms are exciting. But you didn't know at the time.
It didn't threaten me in any way. It threatened the house and the house. They had these big trees going down all around the house, but it was really sort of exciting.
Yeah, storms are exciting, but the aftermath is. The football team in athletics at that time, and what was it?
Well, of course, as we had talked, of course. We played sports. Of course, as a boy, your whole life was around that. I mean, you asked what we did when we were kids. I can't remember when we weren't doing something that involved sports and it was pickup teams from the neighborhood and all that stuff, all the way up through high school. And,
I have that same experience,
but then thing. It was all pretty much a neighborhood type thing.
But then I grew up in the era where Little League was starting, and so we got into that, and Babe Ruth League, so something more organized, which were good experiences. But today it seems that the kids are so organized, so they don't really know how to.
Well, not quite the same way.
Who was your coach when you played football?
Charlie Broderick. I was there because Charlie Broderick came in 1932, and when I only played my senior year, which would have been 1933. But Leominster, at that point, had some terrific football teams.
Yes.
And of course, the high school, because I remember going to games when the games were played up in back of the high school before Doyle Field.
Before Doyle Field was built. I hadn't registered with me.
That's right. And of course, when Doyle Field was built for a high school, that was it was fabulous as a place to play.
Yes, and
Frank, all the football team still practiced up at the high school, and the locker room was there. We'd go to Doyle Field just to play on Saturdays.
And you'd walk, right? Would you walk from Doyle Field to?
Oh, probably.
Yeah, because I remember when
we didn't have to walk to practice there because we practiced all the time, except on the day before a game. We used to go on Fridays. We'd practice at the field.
And that field was really a gem for years. Beautiful. Frank Trager, the contractor, Trager.
Compared to what anybody had, it was just wonderful as a field. And compared to Crocker Field, it was Crocker always had problems being right close to the river up
Yes.
there. And,
Yes. And now in 2008.
But the rivalry at the high school level, from a sports standpoint, was intense with Fitchburg and Gardner, but mostly Fitchburg.
Yeah.
And that Thanksgiving Day was well, the game was a very big thing, and almost everybody went to the game on Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And then everybody came home. It was a big reunion thing when everybody came home on Thanksgiving. Everybody still had to go to the game.
Yes, yes, and that's still to a degree is still the same, you know, and maybe not the intensity.
And
but
they did have, in a way, the misfortune that later on in years, when we started to try and do some things, but from a regional standpoint, actually, I would think some of the most progressive things in regionalization were made when Freddie Johnson was chief, when they started all of the regionalization and the cooperation with Fitchburg and the fire department.
Chief Johnson of the fire department, former chief. Yes, and now.
And that was one of the really first things, and that was very successful. It wasn't quite as necessary from a police standpoint, but I guess it was some of it. But then later on, it became obvious that it was going to be more practical to have a lot of these social organizations, including chambers of commerce and all that sort of thing, joint for an area rather than just focused on one city.
Right, it makes great sense.
Those combinations became very difficult because people still couldn't get away with that rivalry between Fitchburg and Leominster based on that football game.
But now here in 2008, I think we have
oh, I think we've
come a long way. We've come a long way.
Have. It's very different.
Yes, yes. When nearing the end of this interview, it's been very, very informative. I always like to ask if you could think of one of your fondest memories of Leominster. I know that's not a fair question off the cuff, but is there anything?
Well, I'm not unprepared for it because we had discussed it as a possibility, and I had, to be very honest, I had difficulty in finding things that were the fondest for me. I have memories of things. I just all of a sudden happened to think this morning of and it had nothing to do with Leominster. It was, we went to the Cape when I was very small, and it was the first time I was allowed to go out, and I learned to row a boat and rowed a boat. I practically lived in a boat down there for probably a weekend. I remember I just remember a very bad story in connection with that is that they had collected this cat nine tails when we were out at the Cape, and they were stored under the bed somewhere. And I go out in this boat, and it's hot, and I'm spending a lot of time, and all of a sudden I have to go to the bathroom. And I rush, and I'm not in time, and I get home, and I'm a mess, and I'm so embarrassed. I crawl under the bed, and I ended up in all these cat tails. And I remember what a mess I was to clean up with the family. That's not a very memorable occasion, but it's and not Leominster, but I just was thinking of it. But it's in Leominster. I don't think of anything special. There were the things that. The exciting things like the Nickerson Fire or the Music Hall Fire.
We had a
things
lot
like
of fires.
That, those types of things that, because I lived downtown, I could do it. And but as far as really, I remember how exciting it was to go to Scout Camp and things of that type.
Winoxet in New
I went to
Hampshire.
Winoxet when I was 8 years old, and they didn't have any Cub Scouts. They had a wonderful program called the Boy Rangers, and that was wonderful. An all-Indian program. It was wonderful. But those things are
so
I don't know that I think of anything that was overexciting that I remember. An incident I can remember that was sort of frightening. quite young, and I was up visiting my grandmother's. I was staying up there on Grove Avenue, and I remember walking down from the second floor, meeting this strange guy coming up the stairs. A guy had broken into the house, and they had this guy where police all come and they capture this guy. All this, that was quite an exciting time, but that wasn't memorable, I don't think. Yeah.
We should mention now your business, Anderson, Bagley, and Mayo. We haven't. What about your business career, your long business career?
Well,
tell us something about that before we conclude. It's been a long time down in Leominster.
Some people have more luck than others.
The interesting thing about that situation, Bob, is that we formed our agency, Anderson, Bagley, and Mayo, back in 1981. But the three of us individually had been in business and had our own offices. And we competed against each other, but were also very friendly.
Right.
So after things evolved, the merger made a lot of sense because we respected each other, and we joined forces back in 1981. And our previous history, as far as I'm concerned, is my father started our agency back in the 30s. And so we've been involved in the insurance business, since that time. And Don Anderson, who was one of our original partners, passed away in 1993, unfortunately. And so Wynn and I are the survivors.
And
we still have family members. I have family members running the agency right now. Yeah.
Well, I had been very active in a lot of things with Tom's father, though he was older than I. But we were involved in a lot of social things, projects locally, and very good friends. And it was always, as I got older in business, I always thought of it as a possibility. And the thing that really prompted us to get together was the fact that the savings bank wanted to build their building, and they wanted to use the land where Don had his office, Don Anderson. And I just met him on the street one morning, and he stopped and he was looking for a place to go. And I said, well, why don't we merge with Tom Bagley?
And the rest is history.
And my father had passed away a couple of days prior to that, a couple of years prior to that, so it just made a lot of sense.
It made a lot of sense, and it worked out very well.
It worked. We were very lucky.
Well, it's time for us to conclude this interview. Wynn, I want to thank you very much for sharing your recollections, some of your recollections of your memories in Leominster. We're glad that your wife convinced you to stay in Leominster. And Tom, we want to thank you for your part in this interview. And again, another interview. We'd done a previous one. And as always, and also I want to thank Mrs. Alice Wong for her help with this interview. She's here today in the studio. And as always, I want to thank Carl Pimarini, Jack Selly, Dennis Cormier, Tina Pimarini, Mike Cooley, who's here today working some of the equipment. And as always, I want to thank you, the LATV viewing audience, for tuning in to Leominster Neighborhood Snapshot. Thank you very much.